Hello, and this lesson is going to continue our exploration of implementing screen-based rules. In these lessons, we're looking at the definition of business rules within the screens and around the screens using JavaScript. So we're first of all going to discuss the definition and use of validate scripts. And we've been exploring over a series of lessons and videos the different types of scripts that can be defined in the fields of a screen. Let's remind ourselves of some of these. This is a screenshot of the case entry screen, and you can see that I've started to define a new case. Each of the fields within the screen can have a rule defined against it, and you can see I've come into administration, customization, cases, and I'm now looking at the screen case detail box, and you can look at each of these fields. They can have a rule defined against it. Each field can have a create script, an on-change script, and a validate script. When we started to look at the create scripts, we explained that these scripts are fired when the screen is requested from the browser. That the browser is making a sequence of HTTP requests that are reacting on the server. So the server receives the request, and as each field definition that makes up the screen are pulled in from the metadata, this triggers the fields to fire their create scripts. So the create scripts are executed on the web server within the Sage CRM application. Now, create scripts are mainly used to change the properties of fields, that's their scope of effect, and to change the HTML that's then delivered into the screen. If you change the properties of a field, you change the HTML that's delivered into the screen. And as you can see here, that it's been used to create an image field, so it can have really quite dramatic effects of what we do. So create scripts can read the context of information that's in each screen, and then they can carry out work, but what they can't do is interrupt the commit process. They're not used for blocking the saving of data. And recently we've also discussed in videos how we can add code to change what goes on inside the browser. In terms of the different types of script that we're interested in thinking about, then controlling the behavior when the screen is changed into edit mode takes place. That is when we're thinking about something like an on-change script that will fire when it detects the value in a field as altered. So the sort of typical work that an on-change script does is to change a value that's being entered into a field, and so here you can see that I've started to enter in a surname that is in uppercase. So if I type in data in the wrong case, then it can be used to automatically correct to bring the data in tolerance. So I've corrected the data so that it's now matching our requirements from the business. But what if we do at some point, the data has to be saved, and that means that we would be then submitting the form as another HTTP request to the server. So here is when we're trying to commit data, and it's at the commit time when each field within the screen can have a validate rule. So the validate rule is there to check the quality of the data to make sure that the data does not break any of the business rules that we may have set. So validate rules are the only ones that can block the insertion of data into the database. So this is the first type of rule that's our focus then for our lesson. If you remember what we've discussed previously, at the start of discussion of different types of business rules, I talked about how we can categorize rules to different types. I break down business rules into 4 broad types. There are more types than these, but these 4 categories are the main ones we typically need to consider when implementing business rules in Sage CRM. So you might have a restrictive rule, a corrective rule, an informative rule, and a manipulative rule. When we think about create scripts, they're largely informative in nature, changing the interface and changing the HTML on the screen. On-change scripts are largely corrective and possibly informative, as they dynamically change the data entered by the user to bring it into tolerance within business rules, and they may or may not display a message as they do this. And validate rules are largely restrictive in nature, but even with these rules we'll see that they're not just used to block actions. When we think about any of the different types of rules, we have to consider that there are limitations within each scripting environment. We always have to consider each script's ability to have what its scope of reference is and the scope of effect. If you remember, the scope of reference is concerned with the objects that are available to the script and the access the system provides to the database, as well as the environmental information. That's the information contained within the server itself and the browser itself that the script may be able to access. And then the scope of effect is concerned with the action that the script can perform. What can it do to the data? What can it do to the process in which you're working? The primary purpose of a validate rule is to enforce the integrity of the system. And so here you can see that I'm back looking at a case summary screen, that if I click over to change this, any of the data that's going to be added in here needs to follow rules. I'm just going to highlight two of the fields on the screen. Neither of these fields are mandatory, but if I put a value in the service level agreement field, that's the SLA field, and then attempt to save it, you can see that the system has blocked the commitment of the data to the database, and so we have, as you can see on the screen, a restriction. So the restrictive validate script has been executed that blocks the save of the record. In this example, the validate rule has been defined on the SLA severity field within the case detail box. You can see that I've come into the administration screens, into administration customization, looking at cases, and then down into the screens and down into the case detail box screen. This is a default rule, so it's in the system as soon as it's installed within Sage CRM, and it's a very useful example from which to be able to teach, to be able to understand what's going on. If we look at this in a little bit more detail, I've just picked that up and put this into, picked up that script and put it into a text editor. We can see that the rule is referencing the values passed in from the interface. That's what the values method is doing. It's allowing us to read the data passed in from the interface. And we're looking at two fields, case SLA severity and case SLA ID. Both are being able to be read. So we're checking the values of these fields. Now, if you're not familiar with the logical double ampersand symbol, the double ampersand symbol is used within an if condition to mean that both conditions must be true in order to do the work of the statement. And in this case, what happens is that we set valid to be false. And valid is, of course, a system variable. Valid, like a range of other things, are objects available to the validate script. So the variable valid is just one of the server-side system variables that we maybe first met when we looked at create scripts. But here, like create scripts, validate scripts are executed on the server, so you've got a range of different, largely data-focused methods that you can use to be able to read information that we want about data within the server. Now, although we're using the same language, JavaScript, in the definition of a validate script as we did for the definition of create scripts, most of the objects that we can use are the same, but there is some subtle differences. And I just want to consider the difference between the use of the valid system variable in create scripts and the valid system variable in its usage within the validate scripts and how they're different. So create scripts, usage of valid, and validate scripts usage of valid, slightly different. In a validate script, when valid is set to false, then the commit to the database is interrupted, as we saw within this screen. When valid is set to false in a create script, it only allows you to write an information message onto the screen. It never blocks the save of the record into the system.